welcome Libby Sallnow.
Hello everyone, it's great to be here. Although my work has been in London, which has been based down in East London, I did my PhD over the past 6 years up in the University of Edinburgh, so I spent a great deal of time, well, on the East Coast line particularly, but coming up and down and learning about what's been happening in Scotland, what's been happening in London, and looking at the shared knowledge that we're developing. So it's, although it's in London, I think there's great messages for all of us. So thank you for the introduction, Rebecca. I'm a palliative care doctor, and I've been involved, convinced, and passionately supporting the role of public health approaches to palliative care for nearly 15 years now. And the PhD, which I completed and passed just a couple of weeks ago, was really the kind of bringing together a lot of these thoughts, questions, and impacts, really, that I think this work can have. So I'll be sharing a bit about that. I'm going to talk mainly about the results, because I think that's what's really exciting, that's what's new. And we're going to hear, hopefully, from lots of the other talks about how we set them up. So I'm going to talk more about kind of the end game, what these actually mean in practice for us. So Compassionate Neighbours is a project run by St Joseph's Hospice. It is not a volunteering project, it's a project which looks at local people called Compassionate Neighbours who are invited to take part in developing new networks around themselves, around people at the end of life, around people with long-term conditions in the community. It was run in partnership with a community development organisation locally, which had done a lot of work on health advocacy, maternal health, mental health, etc. They hadn't done anything around end-of-life care, but were interested in using some of their learning about the local community and transferring that over to end-of-life care. So the partnership was born and was really one of the key things, I think, in developing the success and allowing the success of the project, because the community development organisation held up a mirror, really, to what the hospice was and wasn't doing. And similarly, the hospice was able to share some of the things that they were doing that people didn't know about. So that kind of partnership was really crucial. This is a picture of one of the early graduations of the first kind of cohorts of Compassionate Neighbours, hugely diverse areas in terms of age, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status. And I'll talk a bit more about what unique learning came out as a result of that kind of context. Story so far. It has been running since 2014. That's when the first pilot started. They've now trained over 200 neighbours who have been matched with 96 people at the end of life in the community. But if you look at the 4,044 individual community contacts, that far outweighs the actual matching. So the matching is a component, but this is not a kind of befriending service. This is not a project that just matches individuals. It's around building community capacity. And so that is a very helpful kind of understanding of where the weighting of the impact of this goes. So the aims of the study, formally my PhD study, was to understand how a Compassionate Communities project could be initiated, what the processes and the tensions that inform its development, how it's experienced by all the different range of stakeholders, and then crucially, what are the impacts, what changes as a result. But personally, the reason I even chose to embark on a PhD study was because, although a huge proponent of the new public health approaches over many, many years, I had a lot of unanswered questions, and the idea of engaging more critically with what this looks like on the ground. We had a huge theoretical body of knowledge, which was invaluable in developing people's kind of understanding of a new way of working, of the kind of the need and kind of the theory of why it should work. But we didn't have much to say, this is what it looks like on the ground, this is how it works, this is who it doesn't benefit, these are the actual people who work within it. So I wanted to really answer that for the field. And I think we need to also voice our own criticisms first so that others don't. You know, I wanted to preempt that. I wanted to say, look, this is where the sticking points are. This is when it won't work. To get past that kind of idea that this is just a universal panacea and say this is how it works in practice. So those are some of my motivations for taking on this field of study. My methods reflected that, so I wanted really flexible, emergent methods. I didn't want to presuppose the outcomes. I didn't want to pick up a kind of validated tool of loneliness and say, I think this is what the outcomes are going to be for this group, or increased social support, or fewer A&E attendances. I didn't want to presuppose what those would be, so I had a very open, flexible approach where I used multiple methods of data gathering, of analysis, to look at what the stories that I was really hearing were, and so it was very inductive. I collected data over 2 years, so it was mainly interviews and participant observation. So I took part in a range of different events and with hundreds of different participants. Documents performed a kind of supplementary role, so it was around where they provided a different perspective to the interviews and the observations. I conducted 2 focus groups at the end, whereby I took back my conceptual model and the themes to understand what the people who had the lived experience really felt of this and critiqued that. And we went through a further process of refining it. And then I also collected the data for all the compassionate neighbours and all the people they were matched with, who were termed community members. So looking at the numbers, who they were referred in by, what their motivations for it was, how many people they were matched with, what other changes they were undergoing, and the number of visits, etc. So I collected that more quantitative data. And this is where I want to really focus on over the next kind of 10 minutes or so, because this is what's new, what's exciting, and what I want to share with you. So 3 main messages that I want to talk about. One, this study now gives evidence of that compassionate communities can be created really out of nothing, and I'll talk a bit more about that. We know that many compassionate communities just exist naturally. They exist, you may be part of them, you may well be part of them, where people are naturally coming together to support other people around issues around death, dying and loss. But we also know that there are many people who are not able to do that, who don't feel able to do that. And I'll talk a bit more about why that is. But this study is an example of how they can be built between a community and an organisation. And it picks up the impacts, and we'll come on to those. Importantly, this evidence that developed from this study kind of reflects back onto the theory of new public health and critiques it slightly. It begins to understand some of the nuances within that and fits it actually very neatly with some of the discussions that we've had this morning around the socioeconomic differences and disparities that people are living within, and how we take the kind of the theory to say, but how does this work across different communities, for different people, across different places? And so it reframes our existing understandings and develops it. And this leads to a new concept that is one of the main outputs of my thesis of the PhD, collective social capital. And that I'm really excited to be sharing with you. It's the first time I've kind of had an opportunity to really explore this and present this at a conference. So I look forward to sharing that over the next few slides. So the first point, evidence about how compassionate communities are actually created, what actually happens when the first person says, let's start a compassionate communities project. And now I'm going to talk about these 4 key themes. And these were my kind of early results, so the first things that came out when I went out and did the interviews, watched training, outreach, the projects, home visits when people were caring for each other, and the conversations that were taking place within the support groups. These are the kind of early themes that I picked out. So the first was that people were engaging as peers. And this will come as no surprise to many of you who are coming from the community development tradition, but this was quite a challenge and quite a different perspective for the hospice. So this was not a service delivery approach. This was not the compassionate neighbours being trained up to go out and deliver companionship or care to people at the end of life who they were matched up with. The person at the end of life and the compassionate neighbour were peers. And this was really supported through the training, through the programme, which was all around community members supporting each other. People out, and you're often matched with someone on your road. So this was very much around peers. But this was a challenge for the hospice, who couldn't really see how to manage the risk within that, and the risk of people having blurred boundaries and supporting each other without the kind of formal boundaries of the volunteering department. And people who were patients became compassionate neighbours and supported others, and compassionate neighbours became patients throughout this process and began receiving care from the hospice. So there was tremendous fluidity across that, but again, something that the hospice struggled with. And people engaged with this as a universal issue through death and dying. But interestingly, many people said, this isn't about death and dying for us, this is about compassion and its broader expression in society. So people came with different motivations or different ways of accessing, but it was this sense that this is universal and it transcends all boundaries. The next was that the power kind of inherent within the relationships within the project were really overtly acknowledged and then challenged. And the hospice couldn't do this by itself. And this is, I think, where one of the key learning points comes in, that you need someone to hold, or an organisation to hold up a mirror to say, why are you doing that? What is that? And the fact that we've always done it this way is not an answer. And so that was what the community development organisation did for the hospice, to say, why are we running the training only during working hours, or running overtime so that mums with children at school can't pick them up, or why are we not running in the evenings? Why can we not have 5 translators all at the same time so that everyone who needs to come in can do the training? So just subtle things, but then some more kind of overt things around not reporting back after each visit. Not having to complete the mandatory training workbook in English, in written English, and other things that were just hugely excluding, which the hospice hadn't seen really. And so through these kind of challenging conversations around, this is a completely different model. We're not looking at a new volunteer project here, we're looking at a community network, and how they challenged and then tailored some of the kind of existing governance and regulations to support that. So these two kind of themes allowed this new space, which was not a pure community development project, it wasn't a pure compassionate network, and it wasn't a hospice service. There was a kind of bit between both. There was a nod to some of the hospice regulations, and the hospice supported some training, but there was also a sense that there was autonomy and freedom. The compassionate neighbours were able to act with their own autonomy out in the community. So it created this new space. And this new space, which was new for the hospice and the local community, allowed this idea of reciprocal relationships, or reciprocity. And reciprocity really is the fundamental term, the concept, the kind of key idea in the whole thesis. Because if you allow people to engage as peers, if there's a level of parity, if there's a level of equality between people, you can begin to act with reciprocity. And you can only do that if you challenge the power differentials, if you allow people to begin acting on a par. So these reciprocal relationships led to a whole set of new networks that were built across the community, including the hospice. And then the impacts that you could see were around loneliness, reduction in loneliness, interestingly not for the people being visited at the end of life. They said, loneliness is not something, we don't feel lonely. They didn't identify as lonely at all. They felt they needed more control. So control was the issue they were lacking. But interestingly, the compassionate neighbours who were being trained to go out, they were the ones who reported they were lonely. And actually the project managed their loneliness. So there were some very interesting things, and that was the benefit of going out with no presupposed ideas, that these really quite interesting ideas that I certainly hadn't understood from my position came out very strongly. There was changed access to services, and the hospice altered its practice. So the community altered its attitudes towards the hospice, and the hospice altered its practice in response to that. And there was evidence, this early evidence of kind of the social ecological changes that Alan was mentioning around this wider impact of changing the environment, physical, social environment with which people were living. So underneath these themes, I began to dig down to understand what was really driving all of this. Power, power, power. It was so clear that this was one of the key things that needed to be addressed and challenged at the beginning. And without that, you would only have a service-led approach. Without really addressing those challenges of the power, you wouldn't move on. Once you had, to some extent, managed to understand that, you could enable reciprocity. And once you had reciprocity, people could begin to change their own environments, the environments of others, and you got agency. And agency is what led to people having improved well-being, changing loneliness, taking action on their own health and for others. So those were the kind of underlying themes as I began to drill down. So this led to kind of some preliminary learning, which was, it's about agency, not company. And that's a really key message for the befriending field, and which has a huge history within end-of-life care and doing a huge amount of good work. But company's not really the answer, agency is. There's some assumptions on the availability of social networks. We know that social capital is patterned according to social deprivation, much as lots of the other health parameters are. And this hadn't really been picked up, so to speak. There's an assumption often that communities are just ready to dive in and jump in and take this work up. But what I was hearing is people were saying, we're isolated, I don't have a network, I don't have anything to draw on, but I want to be part of something. How can I get part of that? The central role of reciprocity is fundamental through all of these relationships, both through the compassionate neighbours within themselves, with their matches that they had in the community, and then with the hospice. So this reciprocity permeated all of these relationships. And importantly, organisations could participate in this reciprocal relation. Often the hospice organisations have been slightly written out of the kind of public health literature, saying it's about communities taking action. And what we want to look at is actually hospices stepping back and other organisations stepping back means they're not being changed, they're not developing their own capacity, they're not being challenged. So this was kind of saying, let's rewrite them back in as organisations that can also learn. So this led, I went a bit deeper then, these are the kind of the preliminary ideas. And I then, as I kind of went to a deeper level of analysis, I tried to pull out what is really driving all of this, what's new about this. And that's when I came up with the concept collective social capital. So social capital, the idea of a set of networks and relationships based on trust, mutuality, cooperation that people can draw on as a resource to support themselves and others. So collective social capitals, so social capital has 3 levels. So bonding is in these similar groups, so people who are the same according to certain characteristics, a church community, a community around a mosque, a school community, people who share certain characteristics and they have similar characteristics and they support each other. Bridging is when you have difference, so you're across different characteristics, different communities, but still interacting, there's no power differential, you're still interacting as peers and you support each other. And then linking social capital is the final one, here, where you're interacting across explicit levels of power, so with a police station, with a health service, with a hospice, and that's often just as, represented as a one-way, so communities try to influence the organisations that support them or serve them, but it's often a one-way thing. And so the literature on social capital suggests that it's the bridging and the linking social capital that allow communities to get leverage, to access new resources and change their position. So if you're looking at social change, then it's the bridging and the linking social capital that allows people to leverage more resources. But my results didn't fit with this understanding of linking social capital, whereby communities and their organisations operate across power and it's a one-way relationship. And so what my study showed in this, that the hospice actually had kind of, to some extent, changed that power relationship. It hadn't completely levelled it, but it had changed it such that the community had much more power in their eyes, much more authority, much more shared ability to look at what end-of-life care should be together. So this reciprocal relationship allowed the hospice to also change its practice, to reflect on what it was doing and to change, alongside the same time as the community, developing their own capacity, reflecting and changing. So this reciprocal relationship between organisations and communities, I've named collective social capital, bringing back the fact that actually we need to have all of the players within end-of-life care and within a society taking this equally. So collective social capital, the definition I've given is a set of reciprocal and interdependent relationships that can exist between members of a community and an organisation when power dynamics are addressed, and this process of learning and capacity development is embarked upon. And then finally, I wanted to kind of contextualise this concept of collective social capital within all of the broader themes, the early themes that I picked up, and this is kind of the final diagram in my thesis, which pulls together all of this. And so I've put together engaging as peers and this idea of a universal issue that affects everyone. And then the idea of challenging power both explicitly and very subtly throughout the whole project, allowing new relationships, a space for new relationships and new networks to be developed, and that leading into the creation of both bridging and collective social capital. The bridging social capital then move into this understanding that there's a new ownership of the hospice by the community. And there were some great quotes where people said, it's like a marketplace. I feel like we've got the keys to the place. This is now somewhere, it's a resource for us to draw on. So there was a completely different perspective of the role that the hospice played within the kind of the community, the social ecology of dying and living with loss in that local area. And the agency then that developed in the participants, the compassionate neighbours certainly, and to some extent those at the end of life, which I'll come on to a bit more. This sense of they had the power to change things within their own area, the power to change things for themselves and the power to change things for others. And that is what led on to the tremendous sense of improvement in well-being that we saw, a tremendous reduction in loneliness, and these new networks that were created were changing people's experiences going forward. I put the power differentials on the bottom because it's often the things that are not seen, and so this is often runs underneath the surface and things are not really easily recognised. So I wanted to make it clear that can be running along kind of out of sight, but is just as important. And the feedback lines go back to, because as people develop more agency, that goes into to challenge the power differentials even more. And we saw that as people became more and more confident, people came back to the hospice and said, actually, you know what, this isn't working either, or went out into maternal health services or mental health services and said, you know what, we're not doing the right stuff here either. So there was a sense that compassionate neighbours went out and began advocating for other areas of their own lives, lives of others. So that then set off a kind of catalyst, really, of a change in power. And similarly, the new ownership of the hospice by the community fed back into the idea that death, dying and loss were universal issues, that actually we all had the responsibility to understand them, to speak about them and take ownership of them. So that's the kind of the precede down answer to how do these work in practice and what impacts do they come from. So the final slide, I think I'm in with time here. The first is that we have seen now that compassionate communities can be created, and importantly they can be created whereby there may not be existing community networks. There certainly are resources, but there's not existing networks that are strong and people are able to build on. And so this is a kind of different model, and there will be so many different models around the world, but a model whereby there might need to be a catalyst or something to start initially. And this is an example of how the role of a hospice can be played at the beginning of that. And it acknowledges the variations in social capital, which we have to be really alive to. The importance of the community taking ownership is great, but the community were very clearly saying in this, we don't feel confident to, we don't know how to. And so there's something around acknowledging the variations that exist. Social capital is not a universal resource that everyone can just draw on equally. And so we need to understand how the variations exist and how we can support people. There's evidence of upstream changes in a community, and the real beneficiaries really were the compassionate neighbours for this, and they have shown a clear change in their support network. So many people became unwell themselves with terminal illness, became carers, were bereaved, and they drew on the support that they had developed from their own compassionate community. And I think that is really the outcome for this. The match is very much a secondary. And the outcomes for the compassionate neighbours shows the strength of participating actively in your own network, whereas the outcomes for those visited at home shows really just what happens when you have one new relationship. And actually that isn't able, if you can't participate with agency within that, that isn't significant to change your life. Whereas for the compassionate neighbours, it was life-changing in many instances. Collective social capital brings together the idea of capacity development across a community, across the services, the individuals, and the community networks. All of them, everyone needs to be involved in their own capacity development. And this conceptual model that I presented I send it out there to be critiqued, rebuilt, tested. I wanted to really develop a kind of map for us all going forward so that people can pick out bits and test, does this work for me, does this not? So we can hopefully have so many iterations of this. So I really leave it as a challenge to all of you. This is my experiences in one big research project in East London. I think there's big generalisable findings from it, but I want to know what it means for all of you and to understand how it can be developed for the future. Thank you.